Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Game of Thrones Season 1. This video will contain spoilers for Season 1 of Game of Thrones, which may seem like an obvious statement, but some who may not have seen the show might have clicked on this video to see if they should watch Season 1, but I'm sorry, this video is not that type of a review and will contain spoilers from Season 1, so it's meant for those who have seen Season 1 of Game of Thrones. However, the majority of this video will not contain spoilers beyond Season 1, so if you haven't seen beyond Season 1, don't worry, you are safe. I will have a section at the end of the video where I compare Season 1 to later seasons, but I will give a proper spoiler warning before I get into that section. So, I began my Game of Thrones episode reviews during Season 4, which means I haven't covered the first 3 seasons on my channel. I did do quick reviews for the first 3 seasons when I started my channel, but going back and watching them, I noticed how bad they were, because it was before I really knew how to do videos properly, so I deleted those and decided to start again. I had gotten several requests to do episode reviews of all the episodes from the earlier seasons, but unfortunately I don't have the time to do separate reviews for each episode, but I will cover all 10 episodes of Season 1 in this video. So this is the first video where I cover the first 3 seasons. However, I do have individual episode reviews on my channel starting from Seasons 4, so if you want my opinion on those later seasons, you can check out those videos on the Game of Thrones review playlist on my channel. So my overall feelings on Season 1 is I quite like it. However, I don't think of it quite as highly as the majority of fans tend to, as many would cite it as the best season of the show. Well, I personally don't think it's the best, and I believe the show did improve in quality as it went, mainly because the showrunners learned more about how to run a TV show and how to write for TV. Whereas in Season 1, it was kind of evident that they were just winging it a lot. I feel like a lot of fans of the books who prefer the novels tend to like Season 1 the best because it was the season that stuck closest to the books, but to me I kind of find that a negative, as they use the books as a, too much of a crux and too much of a fallback, and they weren't really doing their own thing or telling their own story as much as they were in later seasons. And I think it's vital for a TV show to fit in that format and be a self-contained thing that isn't dependent on the viewer being aware of source material outside of the show. That being said, Season 1 did work very effectively to draw the viewer in and get them interested and excited for the show, and leave them wanting for more. So they want to come back for these later seasons. Also, to clarify, I don't think Season 1 is the worst season of the show by any means. I just don't think it's the best either. So now let me get into more details of Season 1 by examining each episode of Season 1, starting with the very first episode of the series, Winter is Coming. Now, it has been revealed that Dan and Dave had originally filmed another pilot that apparently was horrible. David Benioff recounts he had a friend involved in TV take a look at the pilot, and he said, you have a huge problem, to which Benioff wrote down in his notes in big letters, problem. However, HBO, being invested, gave them another chance and to redo the pilot, and they did, and once seeing the newer version, Benioff's friend referred to this as a rare event in television history where they took something that was a giant piece of garbage and turned it into something that was amazing television. He said he had never before had seen something change so drastically to this extent. However, I can see there may have been some issues with how this happened. For example, in the original pilot that we never got to see, which apparently was horrible, they had flashbacks to when the Mad King burned Ned Stark's father and brother alive. And it seems to me that because Dan and Dave had such a bad experience with flashbacks, they purposely were soured to them and shied away from them at all costs for many years. It wasn't until Season 5 that they had a single flashback, and it wasn't until Season 6 that they started having flashbacks more regularly. I personally believe this hurt the show because as a viewer I felt very disconnected and uninterested in the events that occurred before the show started, and these events are actually very integral to the current story. I said before in another video, but I feel even more strongly about it now, is that it was a mistake for the first scene of the show to mimic the books and be the scene where the Night's Watchmen encounter the Whites and the White Walkers. Although that worked in a book series called A Song of Ice and Fire, it doesn't quite work on a TV show called Game of Thrones. In particular, a TV show format, I feel, lends itself to certain expectations that the first scene set the stage for the rest of the series, and I know many people who saw the first scene and expected the show to be about the White Walkers, and in fact this gave way to many unrealistic expectations and disappointments for the White Walkers appearing and being a main part of the story, which they didn't really do in any significant way until all the way up until season 5. Instead, the story that was more important to season 1 was Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon's story. The story of what is happening to the kingdom that has a new king who won the throne after a rebellion which overthrew a dynasty that had previously reigned in Westeros for centuries. And this, of course, not only affected Ned and Robert's story, but also Daenerys's, Catelyn's, Jaime's, practically everyone, whereas the White Walkers was only a small part of the storyline at this stage. So I feel the show should have started the same way the show Firefly did, which I watched their pilot episode recently, where the entire opening scene of that show has the main character, Captain Reynolds, and his first officer, Zoe, fighting in this failed rebellion to defeat the Alliance. And then we flash forward to decades later to when the show actually takes place, but we, the viewer, have this backstory of this war, and we feel connected to it because we've seen it. Likewise, Game of Thrones should have began with the first scene being during Robert's rebellion, and then flash forward 17 years to tell the rest of the story. I always pictured a scene where Ned visits Robert while he's healing in a tent just after he killed Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident, and where he tells Ned to travel south and secure King's Landing. And then we flash forward to present times, and then through dialogue learn more about what was happening, what was the backstory of that scene, and what happened after Ned arrived in King's Landing, and what started the rebellion and everything. This, I feel, would have gone miles to help the viewer feel connected to these past events, whereas as it stands, the viewer feels very disconnected from these past events, only hearing these characters talk about events we know nothing about. And this is something I think a lot of book readers take for granted, that people who haven't read the books don't really understand this backstory because it's not explained in the show very well. And when you're looking at a show, you need to look only at the show because it needs to be self-contained. And, they could have foreshadowed the White Walkers in, future episodes. In the future, maybe have episode 2 or 3 start with that scene, and then, make that storyline, foreshadow it down the line. However, I strongly feel the first season should have started showing what was relevant to the first season, and that's Robert's Rebellion. And I think that throughout the first 4 seasons, those who had read the books take all this background knowledge for granted, and sometimes aren't aware how disconnected those who haven't read the books feel. And that's not a good thing, because the show should be entirely self-contained. And I think part of the reason this wasn't handled properly is because Dan and Dave were admittedly new to TV making at this time. Had they never ran a show before and were trying to salvage a very bad pilot, and so weren't really thinking ahead. But as for the pilot being great, I don't really agree with that either. When I first saw it, I knew nothing about Game of Thrones or the novels. I just heard many people sing the show's praises and talk about how great it was. And my first reaction was, well, it doesn't seem that great to me, but the potential's there. Maybe it could get better, so I'll stick with it. It's funny hearing Dan and Dave talk about how the failed pilot, they said that the version, in that version you couldn't tell that Jaime and Cersei were siblings, but to be honest, I didn't notice this the first time I watched the finished pilot either. And I showed it to a friend who had never seen the show before just a year ago, and she didn't notice they were siblings either. I had to explain it to her. In fact, watching the show now is basically just one throwaway line where Sansa says to Arya something about Jaime being the Queen's brother. That's very easy to miss or to overlook. So therefore, I didn't find the revelation of them sleeping together to be all that shocking. Him pushing Bran out the window was shocking, of course, but nothing earth-shattering. Overall, I felt this was more of a setup episode that set the stage for things to come, but has an episode in and itself. It could be really interesting sometimes and really boring sometimes. So my rating for Winter is Coming out of 10 is a 7, very good. It worked well enough as an introductory to this world and kept me interested enough to keep watching and see where things go, but I wasn't blown away by it or anything, and rewatching it now, I only find it mildly interesting. So the next episode is The King's Road, which I felt built off of the setup in episode 1 nicely, as we learn a bit more about Jon Snow and what the Night's Watch are, as we see him travel with Tyrion up to the wall and learn the Night's Watch isn't as honorable as he thought, as it's filled with a lot of criminals and petty criminals and rapists and stuff. We also got this great scene between him and Ned Stark about him wondering who his mother was. That explained his character and set up this mystery quite nicely. We also got some excitement and suspenseful scenes with Catelyn and Bran being attacked by the killer who tried to kill Bran, where we still don't know for certain to this day who he was sent by. Many believe Joffrey, some still are convinced it was Littlefinger. However, Catelyn was certain it was the Lannisters, so the whole conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters started to brew, so it started the whole mystery and political intrigue. And we learned more about Daenerys rather than simply being a frightened teenage girl, as she learned more to deal with her new situation as Khal Drogo's wife and her asshole brother. And of course we get the scene where Arya attacks Joffrey after he's being a dick, and this leads to her friend the Butcher's Boy getting killed and her direwolf running off, and then them killing Sansa's direwolf, which has implications for the show, down the line. And of course, it's the first time we started to learn how big of a douchebag Joffrey was, and the scene with Ned being forced to kill Sansa's direwolf that did nothing wrong was really heartbreaking. So my rating for The King's Road is an 8, extremely good. This was slightly more intriguing than the pilot episode to me and built on some of the characters and mysteries. It was particularly interesting to get more of Ned and Robert's relationship, and seeing events escalate with the attack on Bran's life was interesting as well. So after that came Lord Snow, where we see Ned arrive in King's Landing and meet characters like Varys, Littlefinger, Renly, and Maester Pycelle. It is interesting that we finally start to see some of the intrigue in King's Landing. I liked Ned's response when Varys said he would say a prayer for Joffrey's safety, which his response was, "Oh, you should have said a prayer for the Butcher Boy." This perfectly illustrates the difference between Ned and Varys, as Varys obviously didn't actually care about Joffrey's safety. He just was playing his part that he was meant to play and putting on an act, but Ned doesn't care about putting on an act and is straight up honest. Some may say this was a major flaw. We also see the feud between Arya and Sansa deepen, which is interesting, and of course we see Catelyn in King's Landing, where she meets with Ned at Littlefinger's brothel, where they further discuss how the Lannisters are enemies. And at the wall, the storyline here was actually quite interesting, with Jon Snow acting all smug because he's a better swordsman than the other Night's Watchmen, not appreciating him very well, but Tyrion is one that gets Jon to realize he has an advantage because of his cushy upbringing, whereas the others were poor and had horrible things happen to him, which is really interesting because Jon was always too busy feeling sorry for himself for being a bastard. He never stopped to realize how much better he had it than everyone else. And it's interesting that Tyrion was the one who pointed this out to him, so Jon makes friends with the other Night's Watchmen who would become his loyal friends throughout the series, like Pip and Gren, and also he comes to appreciate Tyrion, and they part on good terms, which is in contrast to the rest of the Starks, who are gearing to hate the Lannisters. And across the Narrow Sea, Daenerys' story gets really interesting as she starts to act like a queen. Not a queen, but a Khaleesi. And this pisses off her brother, who's a dick about it, and attacks her. But the Dothraki totally kick his ass. So this is where the paradigm starts to switch, where the spoiled brat Viserys, who always bullied his younger sister, is starting to have the tables turned on him. And Daenerys was learning strength in her new position, which was interesting. So my rating for Lord Snow out of 10 is a 7, very good. Another interesting setup episode. Nothing about it was great, but it was intriguing, a good solid link in the chain that held the season together. After that is Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things, and this was kind of a slow episode. In this episode, we get a lot of the Hands Tournament, which frankly I found extremely boring the first time I saw it. I do appreciate it a little more now that I'm aware and introduced important characters like Loras Tyrell and the Mountain, but I still don't think that highly of it. In fact, the common complaint I heard from many book readers is that this show cut out too much of the tournament, and my response to that is thank God. There's already too much of it in the show, in my opinion. However, we did get one of my favorite lines in the show where King Robert says, "Start the bloody joust before I piss myself." I love that line. But overall, we get a lot of Ned investigating Jon Arryn's death and finding out about Sir Hugh, which frankly leads to nothing, so overall I found the storyline a bit dull. In Essos, Daenerys again sticks up for herself in the search of dominance over her brother when he's a dick to her, when she just tries to give him a gift. So it was great seeing her once and for all make it clear to him that if he ever hits her again, she'll have the Dothraki cut off his hands. That was great. As for the Wall, we get the introduction of Samwell Tarly, which was interesting in retrospect, but at the time I found the whole thing rather unoriginal and boring. We get the stereotypical bullied character that our hero Jon Snow has to stick up for. Yawn. I think this is where I start to get bored with the Wall storyline. As soon as Tyrion left, it became less interesting to me. But speaking of Tyrion, he was the highlight of this episode, as seeing him go down to Winterfell where Robb is being a dick to him because he suspects the Lannisters of trying to kill Bran, but Tyrion is actually very helpful and sticks up for Bran by giving him a special saddle that will let him ride. This of course confuses Robb. But the best part of the episode was the ending where Catelyn comes across Tyrion at the crossroads and gives a speech about all the bannermen that served her father's house and get them to arrest Tyrion. That was an intense and great way to end the episode. So my rating for Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things out of 10 is a 6, good. This episode was a tad bit more dull than the others and featured a bit too much filler for my taste, but it did have several interesting tidbits and a spectacular ending. So next is The Wolf and the Lion, which had more of the Hands Tournament scenes but wasn't quite as bad, as it also features a storyline with Catelyn taking Tyrion to the Eyrie, which was really cool as they get attacked by the Hill tribesmen on the way and Tyrion saves her life. I do believe this is when Tyrion started to become a fan favorite. And we also get to know Bronn a bit better as he starts to assert himself as an interesting character, and of course we meet Catelyn's crazy sister Eliza, which was interesting as well. But I love the line from Bronn where he says, "Give me 10 good men and I'll impregnate the bitch," about when Tyrion refers to the Eyrie as impregnable. Now, what's interesting about this episode is it doesn't have any Daenerys scenes, nor any scenes at the Wall, so it takes place almost entirely in King's Landing, but a few other scenes with Catelyn taking Tyrion to the Eyrie, and a few boring scenes with Bran and Theon in Winterfell. But the King's Landing stuff was quite interesting. This is actually where the political intrigue was getting really interesting, as we see Ned meet with both Varys and Littlefinger, and at this stage we didn't really know much about either of them. In fact, if I remember correctly, when I first saw this, I was actually trusting Littlefinger. My mistake. And they have scenes with Arya and Syrio Forel, who was an awesome character. I love their scenes together. And in this episode, we see Arya chasing cats throughout the city, and where this is where she sees Varys talking to Illyrio, plotting how to put Daenerys on the throne, which is the first inkling we get that Varys is a Targaryen supporter. However, it wasn't quite clear. In fact, it wasn't until years later, after watching the scene many times, that I understood it, as Arya didn't really understand what was going on either, and we see it through her eyes. This episode had a couple of great dialogue scenes that expand upon what was in the books, which were limited to point of view to a few viewpoint characters, where here we get a great scene with Loras and Renly, which makes it clear that they're lovers, and also lays the groundwork as to why later on Renly would proclaim himself king, something that wasn't very clear in the books, but it was crystal clear here, and I personally consider it a massive improvement. And we also get the scene with Robert and Cersei having a heart-to-heart about how the relationship never could have worked. This was another great scene that added a lot to the story that we didn't get in the books. Something I found interesting is that thanks to Yoren, who rode to King's Landing as fast as he could to tell Ned about his wife taking Tyrion prisoner, he had the advantage of hearing about this first, and in fact had plans to tell Robert about it first to get ahead of everything, and had he actually done this, things would have worked out much better for him. They could have gotten ahead of the situation before it spiraled out of control, but instead he gets distracted by Robert wanting to kill Daenerys, which of course offends Ned's honor, so instead of getting ahead of the Tyrion situation, he lets Robert's plans to kill Daenerys divide them, and he quits in a fit, thus dividing him and Robert when he needed them the most. So this is a powerful example of how stupid Ned Stark was, and how he was too controlled by honor, and how his downfall was mostly his own fault by having his head up his own ass when it comes to honor, instead of seeing the political realm in strategic terms. And one thing I want to gripe about is in the scene, Ned refers to Daenerys as a child, which leads to a major complaint I had of season 1 and the show overall that I mentioned before, that the show aged up all the children in the show by like 3 or 4 years. A decision I strongly agree with and felt worked, but the characters sometimes still acted like they were younger than they were. And this was made worse by the fact that the 17-year-olds were played by actors who were clearly in their 20s. So it's so off for Ned to refer to Daenerys as a child when she's clearly in her 20s. But even if we overlook the casting and take the show at its word that she's 17, in medieval times, life expectancy was much lower. Therefore, teenagers were mostly considered adults, not children. So it would be silly to call even a 17-year-old a child, as she would be looked on as an adult. In fact, I personally think it's still silly in modern era to refer to a 17-year-old as a child, but even more ridiculous in medieval times. This also applies to Robb Stark, who is often referred to as boy because he was 14 in the novels, but in the show he's clearly in his 20s, so this really irritates me. But enough of that tirade, and getting back to the episode, it does have a really epic ending when we get a sword fight between Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister, and that was quite exciting and a great way to end the episode. So my rating for The Wolf and the Lion out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. This episode raised the stakes with the story of Tyrion being abducted and seeing how this affected things in King's Landing, and raised the danger Ned was in extremely fascinating. However, I wouldn't refer to this episode as great, as it did move rather slowly at times. So next is A Golden Crown, and I do think this was the first episode that really made me stand up and take notice of this show as a whole. And the first scene that I really get enticed and was dying to see what happened next. This episode begins with the aftermath of Ned's attack with Jaime, and this is where I truly began to despise Cersei as she tried to spin what happened into Ned's fault, but it was really fascinating. So Ned acts as king as Robert goes out on the hunt. When he learns about the mountain burning innocent villagers in the Riverlands, he sentenced the mountain to death and sends out Beric Dondarrion to carry out the sentence. This, of course, is the birth of the Brotherhood without banners, and I don't think the show was thinking ahead when they did this scene, because I think they would have handled things a bit differently and established Beric Dondarrion a bit more as a character. As in this scene, he was a forgettable character that just popped up out of nowhere, so they knew he would become an important figure later on in the series because of the book, so this should have been handled better, as was, when Beric Dondarrion reappeared in Season 3, I, and probably almost everyone else who hadn't read the books, forgot all about this scene and didn't remember this at all. So yeah, this could have been handled better, but it was still a very intense scene. And then we see Ned start to make more mistakes as we see him plan to leave King's Landing to go back to Winterfell. And just imagine how things would have been so much better for him and his daughters had he simply left right away. But instead, his damned honor gets in the way, and he started to catch on to the fact that Joffrey wasn't Robert's son and was in fact Jaime's. I think he was a bit slow in this regard, as I caught on to this a while ago, but then again, I had the advantage of already knowing Jaime and Cersei were having sex. However, the scene where he reads the genealogy book and sees all the Baratheon boys have brown hair up until Joffrey, who has gold hair, has been disputed as nonsense by those with any knowledge of how genealogy actually works, but I'm willing to suspend disbelief in this regard for the purposes of plot. And of course, the highlight of this episode was Tyrion's trial by combat at the Eyrie, which particularly stuck out to me when I first saw it. This, I think, most definitely is where Tyrion became a fan favorite, as the scene where he's confessing his crimes was absolutely hilarious and showcased what a fascinating, witty character he is. And of course, he got even more interesting with the battle, where we also see what a great character Bronn is, where he wins the battle by acting dishonorable. And when Lysa points out that he doesn't fight with honor, his response is to point towards the corpse of his enemy that fell out the moon door and say, "No, but he did." A classic Game of Thrones moment. This is also the episode where we're introduced to Osha, where Bran is attacked by wildlings and saved by Robb and Theon, and they take the surviving wildling Osha captive, and she'll later become an important character. So this scene was not only exciting, but also helped establish Theon and Robb as characters, as to be honest, I didn't really have that firm of a grasp on who they were at the time, so this was great. And of course, we also get a turning point in Daenerys' storyline, where Viserys realized he's fucked, and he tries to leave with Dany's dragon eggs, and it was a great scene where Jorah just blocked his path, stood in his way from taking the eggs. This is where I really started to like Jorah and see how loyal he was to Daenerys. So Viserys backs down, but of course is still troubled, so does this very dumb thing of publicly threatening to kill Daenerys. I suppose he was too arrogant to realize that regardless of the outcome, he was just signing his death warrant, and we get his death in a glorious fashion with the classic line, "Crown for King," where Drogo, gives Viserys a crown he was promised by pouring burning gold on him, killing him. One of the better deaths on Game of Thrones, and a very memorable one, as it was established that even main characters will die, as we thought Viserys while he was the Targaryen heir, but that all changed in one scene. So my rating for Golden Crown is a 9, excellent. A great episode that was exciting, and what really got me to realize how great of a show Game of Thrones is. So next is You Win or You Die, which was an even more thrilling episode that totally shocked the hell out of me and it was thrilling throughout. So it starts out with this great scene where the episode gets its name from, and when in fact the name of the show is name dropped, where Cersei infamously says, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground." Say what you will about Cersei, as she does make a lot of stupid and totally arrogant moves, the one thing that's clear is that she is in fact better at playing the Game of Thrones than Ned, who was, has made even more mistakes because he doesn't even think of it as a game. He just lets honor drive him, which is in fact even more stupid than anything Cersei did. Although I am struck by how much Cersei's plan was dependent on Robert getting killed on the boar hunt, which we know for a fact she did conspire with Lancel to get him drunk, so he was bound to have a fatal fatal accident on his hunting trip, but still, that's not a foolproof plan, and had it failed and Robert came back okay, she would have been fucked. And again, Ned made even more mistakes by not telling Robert about his children because, King Robert was dying, and by trying to give Cersei, lead time in order to get away instead of moving against her immediately. And Ned made a mistake by not backing Renly, who had the monetary support and the support of the people, unlike Stannis, to make an actual viable successor to the throne, but Ned let the fact that Stannis was the legal heir blind him to what move was the smartest. So in retrospect, this episode was just riddled with Ned Stark's mistakes, so that the ending shouldn't have been all that surprising, but it was. Because the thing is, when I first saw this episode, I hadn't read the books or anything, so I was still looking on this show as I would any other TV show. And in any other TV show, they would set up this epic battle between the honorable Starks and the evil, sinister Lannisters, and the hero of the series, who appears on the cover of the DVD, who is played by a well-known actor, would win the day, becoming protector of the realm, but the conflict would still continue, and he would continue to fight off the evil Lannisters, and the weekly conflicts would just go on from there. Of course, our hero wouldn't die or outright lose, because good always wins in every TV show. But the moment Littlefinger pulled the knife on Ned, where all of his men were being slaughtered around him, proved me wrong. And it proved that this was no normal TV show, and it didn't at all follow the normal rules and cliches all other TV shows, even great ones, did. And in this show, there are no rules, and there's no hold bars, and absolutely anything could happen, and that's what was truly shocking and truly great about this episode. Of course, it wasn't just Ned's story. We also got a great scene at the start of the episode where we're introduced to Tywin Lannister, a character we heard about for a while, but we finally get to see in this amazing performance by Charles Dance, where he makes it clear to Jaime what it means to be a Lannister, which was such a great scene. The downside of this episode, in my opinion, were the scenes at the wall where Jon and Sam say their oaths at the Heart Tree, and Jon is sad because he's named a steward instead of a ranger. Oh, poor Jon. However, even the Daenerys scenes were on point in this episode, as it begins with Khal Drogo not giving a crap about going to Westeros or taking the throne, but then we see the assassination attempt that King Robert had been plotting, in this amazing scene where a wine merchant tries to poison her, but Jorah, who had been spying on her, changes allegiances and decides to save her instead, when he sees this attempt is about to happen. It was such a great scene. And then when Drogo learns that the Westerosis tried to have her killed, he changes his tune in this awesome speech where he vows to take the Iron Throne for his son and bring those who tried to kill his Khaleesi to their knees. What a great scene. However, getting back to King's Landing, the other interesting thing about Ned's downfall, and arguably the biggest mistake Ned made, was to trust Littlefinger. This did indeed surprise me, because Littlefinger did in fact have me fooled, where I didn't think he would act so brazenly against Ned. But then again, this was foreshadowed in the scene that coined the phrase sexposition, as Littlefinger tells the story of how he was nearly killed by Ned's older brother over his love for Catelyn, and this is told while two prostitutes very loudly have sex with each other. I think this is the worst example of sexposition on the show. However, overall, I never thought of it as that big of a deal as many others make it out to be, as I could see why they chose to do the scene the way they did, because it did add a certain tone to Littlefinger that foreshadowed how shady this fellow was, especially when he talked about how he wasn't going to fight them, he was going to fuck them. Quite appropriate in my eyes. And of course, Ned continued to be blind to this when Littlefinger suggested that Ned support Joffrey's claim and in secret work against them, which is what someone who knew how to play the Game of Thrones would do, but instead Ned blindly follows his honor and was stupid enough to think Littlefinger would go along with him. So my rating for You Win or You Die is a 10 the best. An amazing episode, my favorite episode of Season 1 and one of my favorites of the whole series. This was the Crimson Tide episode where the throne is really up for grabs, but instead of taking the cliched route, the show proves it follows more of a historical precedent rather than TV tropes, which proved to me what a masterpiece this show is. So next episode is The Pointy End, which was hard to watch at the beginning as any remnants of the Starks in King's Landing were completely wiped out, and where Sansa is taken prisoner by the Hound, but Arya gets away in a great scene where they come for her while she's with her dancing instructor Syrio Forel, and even with a wooden sword he still kicks the crap out of a whole team of Lannister soldiers long enough for Arya to get away. Though they never reveal what happened to Syrio Forel, which led to a whole slew of theories that he's still alive, some of which I believed as well, because it seemed to me he could have simply took one of the swords off of one of the fallen soldiers, and then he would have really kicked their asses with an actual sword. But the showrunners continue to insist Syrio Forel is dead, but then again they can't always be trusted. But it's been so long, I doubt anything else will be revealed with him. Anyway, this is what was truly engaging about the episode, was seeing Arya get away and use her sword to kill a stable boy trying to turn her in. It was truly exciting. Whereas seeing Sansa treated like shit by the small council, acting like despicable swine, all cowering around Cersei and acting like mindless minions, even Varys was a bit hard to watch. However, we see in other scenes where Varys goes to Ned, where he's in the cell, and he explains it's all just an act, and Varys just wants to do what's best for the realm, but has to look out for number one first. And if this means acting like how he's expected to act, then he'll do that, but it doesn't really make him a good guy. He even says himself that he is no hero. But what's even more exciting is seeing Robb Stark's response, where he calls his bannermen to go to war. Now what's interesting is that in the commentary for this episode, George R. R. Martin, who wrote this episode, revealed that he had originally wrote a montage where we see the Ravens arrive at all the various bannermen's castles. Like we see Great John Umber getting a raven while drinking a beer, and Roose Bolton getting a raven while he flans a man alive, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, Dan and Dave rejected this because they didn't have the money to do a scene like that, which at the time was prohibitively expensive, which makes me realize how much more the show could have done had they had a bigger budget in season 1 like as they do now. But the reality is no one knew how successful this show would be at the time, so it didn't have much of a budget. What a shame. But we did get some great scenes with Robb's bannermen, such as the whole "your meat is bloody tough" scene with Great John Umber after Grey Wind bites off his fingers, which was amazing. And then Robb marches south, which was truly exciting, and we see him reunited with Catelyn as they figure out how best to move against the Lannisters. And Tyrion's storyline was fascinating as well, as we see him and Bronn attacked by the Hill tribesmen while traveling through the Vale, where we get my favorite line of the entire show, where the tribesmen ask Tyrion how he would like to die, and his response is, "At the age of 80, with a glass of wine in my hand and a woman's mouth around my cock." A typical Tyrion response. Of course, he does, talk the Hills tribesmen out of killing him and Bronn, and instead he brings them to meet his father, which was a very interesting scene indeed. The stuff at the wall was okay, I guess, as Jon deals with learning what happened in King's Landing and nearly kills Alistair when he acts like an asshole about it. So he gets in trouble with the Lord Commander, but later gets out of it by saving his life when he's attacked by a White. And this is interesting, as the Night's Watch are now aware of the dead are rising. But my least favorite scenes were the Daenerys scenes, which although were necessary for the overall story, it's hard to watch as she's very obviously stupid in trusting the witch, who is very obviously poisoning Khal Drogo, and you realize that the adventure that were promised with Drogo invading Westeros in the previous episode isn't going to happen. So my rating for The Pointy End is an 8, extremely good. Some really exciting stuff in this episode, but also a lot of scenes that were hard to watch, and the Daenerys stuff in particular was a bit disappointing, but the excitement of seeing Robb go to war was promising and really raised the tension. So next is Baylor, an episode best known as the episode where Ned Stark dies, and many consider this one of the best episodes of the series because of it. I personally don't consider it one of the best of the series, but it was still a good episode. I love it. I feel many forget that Ned Stark dying was just one scene at the end of the episode, and there was so much more in this episode. Besides, to me, Ned getting arrested was more shocking than him dying, as that was the first hint that he could totally fail. His death almost felt like a formality at this point. That being said, I still wasn't expecting him to die, and up until the last moment I was expecting someone to pop up and save the day, because again I was thinking of normal TV shows, and the show proved once again that it is not a normal TV show. And the scene itself where Ned dies was very nicely done and extremely powerful. However, the rest of the episode was pretty good as well, as we followed Tyrion even more as he continues to prove that he is the best character in the show, where he deals with an almost certain doom when his father informs him he will be in the vanguard against the battle against the Starks. And so we meet the character of Shay, who is a very different character from the books, and for the better in my opinion, as she's more of a mysterious ruffian. And see the whole drinking game scene where we learn about Tyrion's backstory, about his marriage, was very powerful indeed. However, it ends in a kind of comedic cop-out where he goes to battle and gives a very good speech, but it then is comically knocked out by accident and misses the entire battle. Of course, this saved his life, but some may consider it a cop-out that they skipped over the battle, which is another result of Season 1 not having that big of a budget, but I thought it worked out well enough. They also skipped over the battle at the Whispering Wood, where Robb defeats Jaime, as the battle with Tywin's forces was only a diversion. And again, I didn't really mind that they skipped over this battle. However, I have to admit this episode would have been more epic had we seen it. But we do get more of that in later seasons when the show gets a bigger budget. But it was so awesome seeing the arrogant Jaime get captured by Robb, and his, in Robb's tempered, wise response of telling his troops not to get too excited as they still have very many battles in front of them. It made me a huge Robb Stark fan. And of course, earlier we got the first appearance of Walder Frey, as Robb made the pact to marry one of his daughters, a pact he would later grow to regret. It was great seeing Walder Frey. He does Despicable so well. And at the wall, we see Jon given Longclaw, which was a great scene, and also Aemon's little talk with Jon, where he reveals he's Targaryen, was also a powerful scene. And across the sea, we see Khal Drogo's downfall as he succumbs to the sickness due to Daenerys' idiocy. So this was, again, hard to watch, but it was cool to see Ser Jorah put on his armor and take on the Dothraki Screamer in single combat. So my rating for Baylor is a 9 excellent. Not one of the best episodes of the series, but still a powerful one. Ned's death was shocking and pulled off in a powerful manner, and it was great seeing Tyrion deal with his impending doom, and Robb makes headway against the Lannisters, but the Wall and Daenerys stuff, that was just okay. So finally, we get to the finale, Fire and Blood, which begins with the aftermath of Ned's death, which was harrowing indeed, and arguably even more powerful than the death itself, as we see, the hell that Sansa's life has become as she's tormented by Joffrey. We see Arya, see her father die, but, hope comes when she gets help from Yorn from the Night's Watch, who promises to take her north. And we see the devastation that Robb and Catelyn are feeling in a very powerful scene where they vow to kill them all. And we see that Bran and Rickon are aware of their father's death before they're even told about it, which was also a powerful scene. The scenes in King's Landing were hard to watch, as all the slimy people praised Joffrey, although we do get an interesting parlay between Varys and Littlefinger, but also get what is, in my opinion, one of the worst scenes in the entire show. Well, it was the worst scene up until this was topped in the season premiere of Season 6, but I won't talk about that. Anyway, the scene I'm referring to is the scene with Ros and Maester Pycelle, where Pycelle is babbling on about how great of a king Joffrey is. Oh, Joffrey is a noble king. And Roz acts like the surrogate for the audience as she falls asleep and is incredibly bored with him, because that's exactly how I felt with this scene. This scene was just extremely poorly paced, as otherwise, this episode was filled with high stakes, high tension, dealing with huge things and setting up for big things next season. This scene was just too slow and boring. The only point was to show Pycelle's old man act was just an act, but really, who gives a fuck? I mean, he isn't even that important of a character. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have revealed this. This was just not the episode to do it, nor the time to do it. This scene was just too boring for this episode. But the episode otherwise was great and quite intense. Not only do we see an absolute monster that King Joffrey is going to be, where he cuts off someone's tongue just for singing a song that mocked the Lannisters, and of course how he has Sansa beaten and forces her to look at her father's severed head. We also get the great King in the North scene, where Rob's Bannermen declare him King in the North, which was such an exciting scene, and we also see Tywin deal with the fact that Jaime has been captured by Robb, and for once he actually does something smart regarding Tyrion and recognizes his wisdom and sends Tyrion to King's Landing to keep Cersei and Joffrey in check, as they both recognize that Joffrey majorly screwed them by killing Ned Stark. The wall stuff I could have done without, as that was kind of boring, with Jon running away to join his brothers and being caught, back by his friends. But it was exciting at the end when Lord Commander vowed to go on a quest north of the wall to find Jon's uncle and learn what exactly was going on. That was quite exciting. And Daenerys' storyline was quite powerful indeed, as Daenerys learns her son was sacrificed to save Drogo, but he's only alive in a vegetative state, and she learns what I could tell all along, that it was just a scheme from the witch to strike back at them. The scene where Daenerys mercy kills Drogo by repeating the witch's words of the sun rising in the west and setting in the east, it was such a sad and very powerful scene. And of course the ending was even more powerful, as Daenerys burns Drogo in a funeral pyre and burns the witch alive. And just as Jorah thought, Daenerys plans to join the pyre. Now, I'll be honest, when I first saw the episode, I honestly thought Daenerys was going to die, because this seemed to play, her storyline seemed to play out the same way of a slow decline of a character that led to their death, as this happened earlier the season with Viserys and then with Ned Stark. So I had assumed they were doing the same thing with Daenerys. So when the fire is cleared and they revealed her to still be alive, not only that, but they actually birthed 3 baby dragons that we had been assured throughout this entire season had been extinct for centuries, and they were alive again with her who survived the fire. That was one of the single most powerful moments that the show has ever had. And after I saw this, I knew I had just watched my new favorite show and one of the best shows on TV of all time, and it was going to be destined for great things. So my rating for Fire and Blood is a 10, the best. The aftermath of Ned's death and the setup with the King of the North and Tyrion becoming Hand was amazing, but even more powerful was Daenerys' storyline, which was hugely emotionally powerful, with an ending that really blew me away like no other. So my overall rating for Season 1 as a whole is a 9, excellent. As with most seasons, it had a slow start and it took me a little while before I really got into it. And it did have a bit too many filler scenes, but overall it was a powerful season that did a great job of introducing its audience to the world of Westeros, all these interesting characters, and it ended on such a very strong, powerful note. So now I'm going to give some of my thoughts on Season 1 as it relates to later seasons. So if you have not seen up to Season 6, now's the time you need to turn off this video, otherwise there will be spoilers ahead. And thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time. But those who have seen up to Season 6 can continue onward. So what's really interesting about watching season 1 in retrospect is that the story starts out with all the characters together and slowly expands where the characters branch out. And this expansion, of course, continues and widens throughout later seasons to the point where it starts to detract later on and bring the characters back closer together, which is finally happening in season 7. And thus in season 7 we're going to see a bunch of character interactions that we haven't seen since season 1, and it will be interesting how the events of season 1 come back and affect these characters. Most interesting among these is Arya's relationship with Sansa. How after they deal with the direwolves, Arya was very angry at Sansa. However, when pressed about it by her father, she confessed that she doesn't hate her now, really. So she still has sisterly love for her, but still there was a lot of animosity between those two of them. So it will be fascinating to see how their reunion plays out in the show. Another interesting aspect of season 1 was about how Robert was so afraid of Daenerys and the Dothraki, and how he gave tons of warnings about how horrible it would be for the Dothraki to be set loose on Westeros. However, Robert was the only one who took that threat seriously, and once he was killed, no one else really took it seriously, including Cersei, who's very dismissive of Robert's concerns about the Dothraki, and now she is going to be the one who is directly challenged by them. I wonder if she will be equally as dismissive of them at first. If so, that will definitely be her downfall. Another relationship we'll get to see renewed is Tyrion and Jon Snow, who had a good relationship. It will be interesting to see where they stand after all these years. Of course, the fact that Tyrion has sided against the Lannisters will help Jon to look upon him favorably still. But, there's going to be different positions with Tyrion being Daenerys' hand and Jon being King of the North, so it will set up a new dynamic indeed. And also I look at Ned less favorably, knowing what I know now. As seeing the show for the first time, I couldn't help but see Ned as the hero and the Lannisters as the villain, but knowing more about their background and the dynamic made me realize Ned is no hero, but someone who is too pig-headed and blinded by honor. For example, in the scene where Ned talks to Jaime in the throne room, where Jaime recounts the events of Ned's father and brother dying and how when Jaime killed him it felt like justice. I really believed Jaime in this moment, that he was doing the right thing, but Ned is very dismissive and is convinced of Jaime's dishonor simply because he stabbed the king in the back. But this is the same king Ned was fighting a war against, and he seems unaware that this king wanted to kill everyone in King's Landing. He wanted to set the whole city on fire. So Jaime was really in the right, and Ned's being an asshole here, which made, had led to Jaime acting the way he did against the Starks and hating them so much because basically they were unjust to him. I know this was attempted to be made clear in the show in season 3, but I felt it was handled very poorly there, but I'll cover that more when I cover season 3. So that's it for my review of Game of Thrones Season 1. Keep an eye out for my channel as I continue to cover the first 3 seasons of the show in the coming weeks, and once that's done, I'll begin my series of Season 7 prediction videos. Also check out my channel as I do many more videos on shows like Star Trek, Humans, The Walking Dead, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.